A chilling dread seized Mark Johnson one brutal winter morning in Montana, during what felt like the coldest spell in American history. He woke with a jolt, his breath catching as he glanced at the thermometer hanging on his porch. It read a staggering 54 degrees Fahrenheit. The air outside wasn't just cold, it was viciously freezing. Every single blade of grass, every tiny leaf was encased in a glittering sheath of ice, frozen in an eternal crystalline moment. Mark, a lifelong Montanan, thought he was hardened to the cold. But this was different. A deep, uncontrollable shiver ran down his spine at the most brutal temperature he had ever witnessed. He mechanically poured himself a steaming mug of hot coffee, trying to find some warmth, and turned on the TV for a weather report. But the howling wind outside, a mournful, relentless sound, yanked his focus away from the screen. Standing mesmerized by the large picture window peering out, he realized the wind wasn't just blowing snow. It was sculpting it. Thick layers were being whipped up, swirling violently into towering white columns that danced and twisted across the landscape like ghostly figures in some wild, stormy ballet. It was terrifyingly beautiful. But then, just when he thought this surreal morning couldn't get any stranger, something happened that made his blood run colder than the air outside. He gasped, dropping his hot coffee cup. It shattered on the floor, the liquid splattering everywhere, completely forgotten. Because through the thick, frosted glass, a sight greeted him that was utterly impossible, a scene so wildly improbable. It felt like a fever dream. Crouched right against the window frame, her golden brown fur dusted with frost, was a mother bobcat. Her sleek, powerful body visibly trembled from the absolutely brutal cold. And get this, she wasn't alone. Huddled right behind her, a small mound of shivering, snow-dusted fur, were 3 tiny bobcat cubs. They were barely distinguishable against the blinding white expanse, their small bodies shaking violently, frail against the elements. Their thin, pitiful mewing cries were almost completely swallowed by the relentless howl of the wind. Then, heartbreakingly, the smallest of the cubs suddenly collapsed. Its tiny, frail form lay twitching weakly in the snow, clearly on the very brink of surrendering to the unforgiving, brutal elements. But here's where it truly got wild. The mother bobcat, as if sensing the desperate urgency, the rapidly narrowing window of time, moved. With a surge of instinct, she gently picked up the smallest cub by the scruff of its neck and brought it right up to the window. Her movements were deliberate, fiercely purposeful, yet incredibly gentle, every fiber of her being radiating a mother's primal determination. She pressed its tiny, trembling body softly against the frigid glass, her own breath instantly fogging the pain. Then she looked up directly at Mark. Her eyes, pools of radiant amber, burned with a desperate, raw hope. They were begging him a silent, piercing plea for help that went straight to his soul. As if to underscore the urgency, the wind outside screamed, howling even louder, slamming handfuls of snowflakes against the window with sharp, violent popping sounds that echoed the sheer desperation of the moment. Mark stood frozen, rooted to the spot, his heart hammering against his ribs like a trapped bird. He had never in all his years witnessed anything remotely like this. Then the mother bobcat raised a front paw, lifting it with deliberate care. She tapped it against the window, a soft, rhythmic click, 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 as her claws met the glass. It wasn't random, it was calculated. It was as if she was trying to send him a clear message, a primal plea for him to finally understand. Mark hesitated, bringing wild animals, apex predators, into his home. It was the absolute last thing he could have ever imagined doing. Fear clawed at him. But then he looked at that collapsed, twitching cub and the mother's desperate eyes. He knew with chilling certainty that if he didn't act now, that little life wouldn't survive the next few minutes. His legs felt weak, shaky, but he forced himself to walk toward the door, his mind a whirlwind of fear and profound uncertainty. He reached the door, his hand trembling, and opened it just a crack. And this is what truly stunned him. The mother bobcat didn't flinch. She didn't bolt. Instead, she immediately brought the weak cub right to the narrow opening, setting it down gently on the threshold. Then she deliberately stepped back, as if to show she wasn't a threat, wasn't going to rush in. Her powerful amber eyes stayed locked on his, still brimming with that raw mix of hope and desperation. He wouldn't look away. Mark knelt, his heart aching, and carefully scooped up the tiny cub. Its frail body felt heartbreakingly light, barely warmer than the brutal ice outside. He gently carried it inside into the relative warmth. The mother bobcat watched his every move intently. Then she deliberately shifted her gaze, pointing her attention toward the two remaining cubs, still huddled together, shivering in the unforgiving snow. She looked back at Mark, her silent, pleading expression absolutely unmistakable. It was an unspoken request. "There are others, my babies." His initial fear now overshadowed by a wave of profound empathy. Mark didn't hesitate this time. He opened the door wider, motioning for her to bring the others. And she did. With the same careful, deliberate movements, she gently nudged the second cub, then the third toward the opening. When all three tiny, shivering cubs were finally inside, nestled awkwardly on his floor, Mark paused again. The mother bobcat stood poised at the threshold, and the wind screaming around her, snow swirling violently against her fur. She waited, a wild creature asking for permission to enter a human dwelling. Mark looked at her magnificent, ice-dusted form, at the vulnerability in her eyes, and finally nodded, stepping back, completely inviting her in. She moved with an astonishing grace, yet palpable caution, pausing just inside to give a quick shake, shedding a shower of ice crystals from her fur, before stepping fully into the blessed warmth of the house. And here's where it truly got incredible. She didn't crash in like a panicked wild animal. Not at all. It was as if she somehow understood she was a guest, a refugee. She stayed close to her precious cubs, her movements measured and careful. She even brushed lightly against a piece of furniture, almost tentatively, as if testing the boundaries of this strange new environment. Mark, still reeling from the sheer unreality of the scene, quickly gathered every blanket he could find. He folded and layered them near the roaring fireplace, creating a deep, warm nest for the unexpected family. The mother bobcat wasted no time. With gentle nudges of her head and snout, she guided her shivering cubs toward the radiant heat, then meticulously adjusted the blankets with her paws and nose, ensuring her little ones were as warm and comfortable as humanly possible. But then, something truly profound happened. The mother bobcat turned her gaze back to Mark. Her amber eyes, no longer filled only with desperation, were shining with an almost startling, human-like gratitude. It felt as if that look pierced straight into his soul. In that moment, he felt an unexpected warmth blossom in his chest, a deep, inexplicable connection to this wild creature that he couldn't possibly explain or deny. Outside, the storm continued its relentless, furious assault. The wind still howling like a pack of hungry wolves on the hunt. But inside, within the walls of Mark's home, the atmosphere began to soften, transforming into a fragile, precious sanctuary against the brutal chaos outside. Slowly, tentatively, the cubs, moments ago trembling and weak, began to stir. The smallest one, nestled deepest in the warm blankets closest to the fire's embrace, let out a tiny, pitiful mew. It was the first sound Mark had heard from them since they arrived, so faint, yet it filled the entire room with an overwhelming wave of hope. Mark watched in silent awe as the mother bobcat leaned down her rough tongue, methodically licking each of her cubs, in turn warming them, coaxing precious life back into their small forms. And get this, despite being wild animals, these tiny cubs displayed an astonishing, almost unbelievable level of calm. They stayed huddled close to their mother, their wide, curious eyes occasionally darting toward Mark, but completely, utterly devoid of any fear. It was as if they somehow understood they were safe here, as if they trusted him completely. Time seemed to stretch and blur as Mark sat and simply observed the incredible scene unfolding before him. The firelight danced and flickered across the bobcat's fur, casting a warm golden glow that stood in stark contrast to the icy, desolate world raging outside. Every single movement of the mother bobcat was deliberate, tender, her ancient instincts honed to a razor's edge, focused entirely on protecting and nurturing her young. The smallest cub, now visibly steadier, even let out another soft sound, this one stronger, more confident. As it curled deeper into the warmth with its siblings, Mark couldn't tear his eyes away, feeling profoundly humbled, as though he were witnessing something both intensely primal and profoundly sacred. The storm continued to rage outside, a furious, untamed force. But inside a fragile, unspoken truce, a powerful bond was quietly beginning to form. The mother bobcat glanced at Mark again, her gaze lingering, this time holding his eyes. It was a look that seemed to say everything, conveying a depth of gratitude that no human words could ever hope to match. Mark, still clutching the empty, forgotten coffee mug in his hand, felt a sudden, unexpected lump rise in his throat. How could a creature so inherently wild, so fiercely independent display such astonishing gentleness, such profound understanding, such trust? The thought left him breathless, utterly humbled. In that powerful moment, he knew with absolute certainty just how extraordinary, how miraculous this encounter truly was. As the long hours of the storm slowly ground by, Mark remained utterly mesmerized by the scene. The mother bobcat, ever vigilant, kept one eye on her precious cubs and the other on him. Her entire demeanor conveyed a sense of hard-won trust, but beneath that, an unyielding, fierce protection. And here's where it got even more incredible. At one point, she stood up, stretching gracefully, and walked slow and deliberate over toward the kitchen area. She stopped just at the edge of the counter, turning back to look at him, her ears slightly perked, almost as if she was politely asking for permission. Mark, his mind racing to understand her silent request, instinctively grabbed a plate and placed a small piece of leftover cooked chicken on it. He carefully set it down on the floor near her. She approached cautiously, sniffing the offering. Then, with that same defining, deliberate care, she picked it up and carried it back to the nest, meticulously dividing it amongst her hungry cubs. The storm outside showed absolutely no sign of relenting. Snow piled high against the windows, burying them, and the wind continued its relentless, beastly howl, clawing at the very foundations of the house. But inside the radiant warmth from the fireplace and the utterly unusual bond that was quietly forming between man and beast created an atmosphere that felt profoundly surreal, almost magical. The flickering firelight seemed to weave a soft spell over the room, blurring the harsh edges of reality. And as the hours wore on, Mark realized something that settled deep in his gut. By opening his door, by helping this bobcat family, he had taken on a responsibility far, far greater than he had ever anticipated. The raw, brutal fragility of life in the wild, especially in conditions like these, was suddenly terrifyingly real to him. He couldn't just let them back out into that raging monster of a storm. They desperately needed time, safety, and warmth to recover, and impossibly, he was their only hope. Over the next few hours, the mother bobcat's behavior continued to utterly amaze him. She was incredibly careful not to damage anything in his home, even using her paw to gently nudge a fallen blanket back onto the nest pile. The cubs, now warmer and more energetic, began tentatively exploring their immediate surroundings. But here's the truly wild part, that they didn't act like typical wild animals. They seemed to inherently understand the boundaries of the space. They stayed close to the comforting heat of the fireplace, carefully avoiding climbing or scratching the furniture. Their tiny paws padded softly against the wooden floor, their movements cautious but brimming with innocent curiosity, as if they too understood the sanctity of this temporary haven. Mark simply couldn't believe what he was witnessing. The intelligence, the awareness, the sheer presence of the mother bobcat were unlike anything he had ever encountered. She even seemed to communicate with him subtly through her body language, a tilt of her head, a flick of her tail, a particular gaze, conveying needs or acknowledgments. At one point, she turned to look at the smallest cub, who was lagging slightly behind its more energetic siblings with a soft, rumbling growl that was more like a mother's murmur. She gently nudged it toward the warmth of the blankets, her fierce maternal instinct radiating from her every gesture. But finally, thankfully, the storm did begin to weaken. The wind lessened its fury. The snow stopped its relentless assault. The mother bobcat, sensing the change, slowly stood up, stretching her powerful body a clear signal. It was time. She nudged each of her cubs tenderly, encouraging them toward the door. Mark walked over, his heart heavy with a mix of sadness and understanding, and opened it slowly. The brutal cold air rushed back in, making him shiver violently after hours in the warmth. The cubs hesitated at first, tiny wild things, suddenly reluctant to leave their safe haven. Their small paws sank into the deep snow on the porch, and their soft, uncertain cries almost lost in the still fierce biting wind. But the mother bobcat was patient, unwavering. With gentle nudges, she encouraged them forward, reminding them of their wild home. And then came a moment that would be etched into Mark's memory forever. Before she stepped out into the snow herself, the mother bobcat turned back. She looked directly at Mark, then with incredible deliberation, reached out a paw and placed it softly on his arm. The touch was fleeting, brief but electric, a powerful, silent moment of connection that utterly transcended species. Her eyes, filled to the brim with that astonishing gratitude, seemed to convey a heartfelt thank you that no human words could ever hope to equal. Then, as quietly as they had arrived, the family of bobcats melted into the snowy forest, their beautiful forms blending seamlessly into the endless white landscape. Mark stood in the open doorway, letting the biting wind sting his face, watching until they were completely out of sight, swallowed by the swirling snow and trees. The silence that settled over the house felt heavy, profound, but not empty. The warmth they had brought, the incredible, fragile sense of life and connection, lingered long after they were gone. He was left with a newfound deep appreciation and awe for the intelligence, the emotions, the sheer will of the wild animals he had always admired, but only from a distance. This encounter, this impossible morning, would stay with him, a story he knew he would carry, etched into his soul for the rest of his life. It wasn't just a story of survival in the face of impossible odds. It was a story of an extraordinary, breathtaking connection forged in the brutal, unforgiving heart of a Montana winter. This incredible experience taught Mark a powerful lesson: compassion knows no boundaries, not even between different species. It showed him that even in the harshest conditions, unexpected bonds can form, and that the wild world holds depths of intelligence, emotion, and trust that we are only just beginning to understand. What an unbelievable story, right? Have you ever heard of anything like this? Let me know your thoughts and feelings in the comments below. If this story touched your heart, please give it a rating, maybe a 10 out of 10, by hitting that like button. And don't forget to subscribe to the channel so you don't miss more amazing stories like this one.